Hello, and welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. I'm your host, Messa Gallivan, a former AVS student, a graduate, and a current staff member at the school. Firstly, I want to thank everyone for sharing your feedback on episode 10. I think I can safely say it's the most popular episode of the show so far. Thanks to everyone who wrote in to let me know how much they enjoyed it. If you haven't heard it yet, there's still time. You can listen at www.alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP10 for episode 10. So far, this podcast has been focused on the experience of students at school. But there is another vital component of Alpine Valley School that is worth discussing: the staff. At a fundamental level, schools like ours would not exist without the dedication of staff members. Whether it's paying the bills, creating marketing plans, communicating with parents, or, most importantly, interacting with students, staff are the jack of all trades who keep things moving forward. For years, it was my dream job to be a staff member at AVS. Back when I was working my 9-to-5 corporate job, I often daydreamed about returning to Alpine Valley as a staff member and using my new skills to give back to the place that had given so much to me. Fast forward a few years, and here I am. But the experience is very different than I could have imagined. In many ways, it is more difficult than I thought. As a staff member at a school like ours, your heart is very much in your work. It's not just an expression. When a student is struggling or the budget numbers are not adding up, it can be an emotionally taxing experience, something I wasn't prepared for. That said, the rewards are also extraordinary. Watching young people experience real freedom and blossom is a true gift, and one I'm grateful for every day, even the days when it's hard. Schools like Alpine Valley School are important, and so are the people who keep them running. My guest today is my good friend Bruce Smith, who is something of a Sudbury schooling journeyman. He's been part of multiple founders groups, worked at least at 3 different Sudbury schools, and been involved in staffing for over 20 years. It's not an exaggeration to categorize him as an expert, and he has some truly insightful things to say about the road that led him here. Here's our conversation. Hi, Bruce. Thanks for being on the show today.
Well, hi, Missa. Thanks for having me. It's great to virtually be here.
So I would love if you would start by giving us a little introduction about yourself, a little history of your time with Alpine Valley School or other schools like us.
All right. Well, my history with Alpine Valley goes back, I think almost 19 years. Actually, I still remember the very first day I worked at AVS because I drove out from my parents on my birthday. And it was 1998, so it would have been November 30th, 1998 when I came on board, which was a third of the way, I guess, through year 2. And my most recent year of staffing at Alpine Valley was the 2014-2015 school year. But as you suggested a moment ago, Alpine Valley is one of actually 4 Sudbury schools that I worked at. And I don't know if you want the nitty gritty, but I started my first Sudbury staffing position was at Liberty Valley School, which was the first Chicago area Sudbury school, about a year before coming to Alpine Valley. So actually it was a year. It was exactly 20 years ago this fall that I started my Sudbury staffing career, which is still something I'm trying to wrap my brain around because I don't feel like I'm old enough to be able to say things like that. And yet, on the other hand, that seems like an impossibly long time ago to when I was first getting into this. So, and in between Liberty Valley and Alpine Valley, I worked briefly at a short-lived Sudbury school in Gainesville, Florida. And when that closed, I had done visiting periods to run for staff at both that school and Alpine Valley. And when the Florida school closed, I was able to come out to AVS. Since working at AVS, I've been staffing at Clearview Sudbury School here in Austin. So, there were a couple of years during my time at AVS that I had to step back from day-to-day staffing and get a desk job at CU Boulder. And but I've always stayed in touch. I've always stayed involved. Actually, I've been a trustee, member of the diploma committee since before we had one. Actually, as part of the group that helped create it, and just I've been very fortunate to continue the very close friendships I've maintained with people at Alpine Valley. So I was really excited to get asked to be on the podcast because I've been listening to all the episodes, and it feels like old home week every week, and just really exciting. I'm so glad that you're doing this, and so glad to be a part of it.
Good. I'm really glad. I've heard that from other people too. Graduates from all over the world tune in and get this burst of nostalgia while also still feeling connected to the school in some way. So, tell me about your life before Sudbury Schools. What were you doing before you heard about this philosophy, and what drew you in?
Well, I actually started out my education career as a regular classroom teacher at a regular public high school in Missouri. Although I didn't last terribly long, I think from my student teaching until my last day in the classroom was about 5 years. And I got out not knowing a thing about Sudbury, actually. I just got out because of the physical, mental stress. It was just massive. It was consuming me, and I knew that I couldn't stay as for all the things I liked about that job and those people. It just wasn't going to work. So at the time, the plan was to return to grad school. I'd already gotten my master's and then got my classroom teaching job. So I was going to go back for a second master's and ultimately, at least the theory was a PhD and teach at the college level because I thought, well, I still like working with young people and I still like playing the scholar. So let's see how it works on the college level. So then I went to the University of Chicago, and while I was actually it was right before it was in the summer between leaving teaching and starting grad school in Chicago that a former student of mine, of all people, someone who had been in the classroom enough to kind of know what I thought about education and the conventional system and how I might want to change things. He he told me about this website for a school called Sudbury Valley. Now you have to understand that this was 1996, so the web was kind of this new thing still. And he gave me this address. I'm like, oh, I typed this thing in, and I go to this place, and oh my God, it was. I tell you, it was just incredible. I thought these people have gone so far beyond anything I could have dreamed of, and they've been already at that point. They'd already been doing it for close to 30 years. And I thought, well, that's neat. I'm going to keep going back to grad school, but I all through that year of grad school, I couldn't get it out of my head, like this crazy, cool, amazing place. And eventually I sent off for information because that's what you did back in those days. Even their website wasn't that extensive. So I sent off for info and they sent me things back. And I tell you, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I had a literal can't sit still moment. I still remember where I was. I was at my job at the library, and I would read a sentence or a paragraph, and I'd just get up and pace around like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And then I'd read another sentence or paragraph and go, holy crap, oh, and pace around again. And so at that point, I thought, I've got to check this out. I don't know what this is, but this is calling to me big time. So I sent them a letter and said, all right, I'm basically ready to get on a plane. Who's going to pick me up at the airport? Because this is what I'm doing. I want to do this. I'm coming. And so fortunately, I got a letter back from one of the founders at SVS, and they said, "Well, before you buy that plane ticket, there's actually a group about an hour away from you that's trying to open a school like ours. Maybe you should check them out." So I did, and that's kind of fun too. That part of the story because my dear friend Melissa Bradford, who is one of the founders of that school, then kind of grilled me, because here I am, this young or young-ish former teacher, no kids, like all enthusiastic, and you never know, right? Who when someone shows up enthusiastic, how much do they know? What are they? What through what lens and what experiences are they viewing this thing that seems like the greatest thing since sliced bread? And so she, vetted me and, like I said, grilled me, asked me a bunch of questions, and I must have passed, because then I joined that founders group. And kind of over the second half of that school year, I saw myself gradually dropping out of interest in the grad school program I was in, and gradually getting more and more involved in this founders group. And I realized eventually that I would rather stuff envelopes and pound the pavement for a cause I believe in than, sit around and read all day, which for me is saying a lot. You know, like, it was just meaningful. There was so much purpose to it, in addition to being everything I could have dreamed about, working with kids and more. So that was the spring of '97, and I got elected to the first staff and was there day one at a school that opened the same year that Alpine Valley opened. And I ended up only staying there for a year because my partner at the time wanted to go back to school and needed to move to do that. So that's how I got from Chicago to Florida to Denver, in a nutshell.
When you were reading the material that Sudbury Valley sent you and you were wiggling out of your chair, what was it about the philosophy that spoke to you so much, do you think?
I'm not sure exactly if it was because you say the philosophy, but I think, and this is a question I've pondered, and I've pondered with colleagues for years. Like, what is it about us that we got it? And I don't mean to say got it like it's this esoteric thing that only a few people can access, but what was it about Sudbury that connected so hard, so strong and directly for us? And I think that for me, it had to have been my experience as a teacher, that it spoke to something in me well, I'll tell you, for example, when I was a first year teacher, of course, that is epically stressful in its own right. Like people will tell you that the first year of teaching is just, it's there's no way for it to be anything other than consuming. But I knew even as a first year teacher that some of the issues I was facing weren't going to get better. They weren't going to change with experience and knowledge and so forth. I found that, and so this is me kind of rationalizing or working backwards. I think that, well, I've described Sudbury, let me put it this way. I've described Sudbury staffing as everything that I loved about teaching with none of the nonsense. Which is not to say that it's hassle-free, far, far from it. But I think that in retrospect, what frustrated me most about being a conventional school teacher was how often and how seriously the system got in the way of people interacting as people and treating each other respectfully and just dealing with what needed to be dealt with in the moment. It's like, I'm sorry, we can't deal with this. We have to get back to the lesson, or I'm sorry. And just the whole mechanics of, I'm so glad for the past 20 years, I've never had to give someone permission to use the bathroom. Well, with the qualified exception of if we were in the middle of JC or something, that that's its own kind of special deal. But hall passes and grades. When I was one of the classes I taught when I was a high school teacher was AP European History, and I've told this story before. There's something really telling about it for me. So there's a lot of writing in an AP history class, a lot of papers and essays and short answer on demand kind of writings. And I discovered something in my 3 years of teaching AP, which was I really like editing. I like to help people write better. I like to line edit. I like to suggest, well, maybe you rearrange these things, emphasize this more, support that better. But then I enjoyed that kind of editing even when I was getting 20 or more copies of or versions of the same basic essay. But then I would have to put a letter grade on it. And I found that it took me maybe 50% as much time to figure out, well, is this an 88 or a 91 or a 90 or and what was the point of that? Really? I mean, I I don't mean to get on my soapbox exactly, but if the point of giving someone feedback on their writing is to help them become a better writer, then it seems to me that that first category of feedback of grammar and style and how to structure an argument and provide evidence and so forth. It seems like that's what's going to help people learn to write. And I doubt that any student of mine would be able to, from 20 years ago, would, even if they had their papers in front of them, would go, oh, well, I can see why this was a B plus and not an A minus. It just seems like that was beside the point. So I think the philosophy, and for me, philosophy is just like the whole package. It just resonated with me in an immediate, deep sense. It's just one of those very rare moments in life, where you just know right away that this is right, or at least that it's right for you. And so I think even before I saw it in practice, um, even just reading about how humane and effective it was, and different. But that's the thing, even though it is a paradigm shift to go from conventional education to Sudbury, there was something in my experience of teaching that helped me jump that gap. And I just knew, because it was, like I said, it Sudbury has allowed me to connect with young people as people, and I don't have all this other stuff that's just getting in the way of that.
Wow. So you now have been involved with this for something like 20 years, I think you said. And I wonder what your involvement is in Sudbury schooling today. I know you said you're a staff member at Clearview, but are you involved with the Sudbury community beyond that?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean, you know that the staff at the schools interact with each other through an email list, or I guess it's a Google group. Um, but beyond that, I have a small nonprofit, the Friends of Sudbury Schooling, which I set up a little over a decade ago to kind of do some behind the scenes work and some out front work. The behind the scenes stuff is, like trying to help schools with all the well, it's hard to describe, but without telling the story. And so the story is that in 2004, when we had to cut two full-time positions at AVS, and through a variety of circumstances, it worked out for me to be one of the two. And so I got this desk job at a university, and I'm sitting there going, why? How did this happen? Why is it that with a team of very dedicated and intelligent and hardworking people, that we had this sudden downturn? And one of the realizations I came to was that there's just so much to do in both running a school on a day-to-day basis and growing it, going out and finding new people, doing marketing and PR and that sort of thing. And wouldn't it be great if we had a small team of people who could who knew what it was like, who had experience in the trenches, who could help out and pick up some of the slack on either side? Because the reality is, at a small startup school, and maybe not so small and maybe not so startup, that it's just it has often felt like to me that uh, to the extent that you are paying attention to the community that you've got, you're, relatively speaking, neglecting going out and finding more people, and vice versa. If you're beating the bushes and working on PR, that's time that you could be spending interacting with the kids and families that you've got. So that's FOSS. It's hasn't it's kind of evolved in ways that I hadn't expected, but it's still around, and we're still doing stuff. And personally, um, more recently, I've been doing a lot of things kind of on my own, so to speak. So I manage a Facebook page called Sudbury Moments, which essentially just shares things from other schools, but it consolidates them in one place. And I pick out Sudbury Moments is the name, because I'm trying to share glimpses, both visual images and things overheard from schools, so that the people, in particular, I think it's largely um, geared toward parents who send their children to these schools and don't necessarily know what it looks like or sounds like or what you would see and hear if you were there on a day-to-day basis. So Sudbury Moments is a way of supplementing that. And then I'm on Twitter, ridiculous amount of time, but it's effective. It gets the word out. Twitter and Facebook have different audiences and different functions, and I consider Twitter activity. I've described it sometimes as an occupational hazard of nonprofit promotion. So I do that on pretty much an everyday basis. And then occasionally I get real treats like being asked to be interviewed, not just by former students and colleagues, but again, this is where the Twitter comes into play. I've gotten interviews just based on my Twitter activity. And, I've blogged, and in the last few years, one particular treat was, or two particular treats, I guess, was that when the Houston Sudbury School was getting started, they brought me out because I was already in Austin at that point, and I helped them on the weekend before they opened, and I was on hand for the first week to kind of give context and support and help train up the staff a little bit, so at least they had a clearer idea of what to do in that first week. And then about a year and a half later, I think, I got to do a similar thing for the Sudbury School of Atlanta, uh, I say treat. I use that word very deliberately because it's an honor actually to be called out, and it's kind of puzzling um, in a somewhat self-deprecating sense, because I still feel in many ways, well, first of all, I feel in many ways like a beginner. Like I'm still figuring this out 20 years in. And the other thing I realized was that, from a staff point of view, and I don't know how much you want to get into this, but it's a team effort, and that's not a cliche. I can think of a number of things, whether it's marketing slogans or web content, where you can look at the final product, but not have any idea, well, which part of that was mine. Um, you know, we all came up with this stuff together, or a decision that was made. So someone at a startup or a newer school will say, well, what should we do about X, Y, or Z? And of course, I have things to say, and more often than not, it reminds me of something that's happened in the past 2 decades. But I realized that the first thing I would do if this or that difficult or confusing or stressful situation arose was I'd go to my team. I'd run it past my colleagues and whoever wanted to talk about it. And we together would come up with a better solution than any of us individually was likely to. So that's kind of my thing now. It's a lot of tweeting and occasional interviewing and consulting and the Sudbury Moment stuff and FOSS, which sounds like a lot,
That sounds
actually.
like a lot. Yeah, it does. It sounds like you're like the Sudbury Ronin consultant. Like you just go around the country and help people with their schools, which is great.
Yeah, ninja Sudbury guy.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. I don't know. I probably do hold the record for the most schools staffed at, but I don't know if that may be a dubious distinction.
Well, so having had all of that experience in all of these different places, if you had to pick one most important lesson that you've learned along the way, what would you say that is?
Well, boy, I don't know. I was well, okay. One of the things that I tweet out every once in a while, and I do recycle material. I will confess, from time to time. But Steve Jobs has a line, or a quote from, I guess it was one of his commencement speeches, maybe the Stanford speech, where he said essentially, like, time is short, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Um, so that would be one lesson, and I think another would be that it kind of puzzles me sometimes. I'll see a video of a young person doing something extraordinary, but to people who have only seen kids in more conventional settings, it's like it's mind-boggling. Like, how can a teenager, how can an 8 or 9 year old do this? And I think, well, it's not that unusual, really. You just let them be who they are. You let them rely on those innate drives and support them, but let them stay in the driver's seat. And of course they can do these amazing things, because that's just what they're capable of, naturally. So I think that you know, just lessons in general that I've just seen the value time and time again of letting young people be who they are and grow into who they are, and the amazing things that can result from doing that. Although you have to give it time. That's one of my most frustrating experiences over the past several years has been when families say after a year or two, or less than a year, or maybe even 3 years, they say, well, this isn't working out, and we're going to try something else. Now, on the one hand, I can't question their decision. And it's a relief. I don't have to. It's not my decision to make. But I wonder often in situations like that, did you give it enough time? Because it takes sometimes far more time than you would think it possibly could to work through boredom and interpersonal conflicts. I think some people, when they first come to Sudbury and see kids just what appears to them to be doing nothing all day, I think a common first impression is that's the easiest thing in the world. Like, how could that possibly challenge a young person to tell them, do whatever you feel like doing? But the reality is that when no one else is telling you what to do or when to do it or how well you're doing or what's worth your time, you have to do that for yourself. You have all the choices in the world. Well, what are you going to do? How do you narrow down all the choices in the world to what am I going to do right now? And it's difficult to explain also because I think it's so much of it just emerges naturally, so that even when, sometimes in retrospect, you can say, oh, look at that young adult, the person in their 20s, like with the podcast. I remember your example, for instance, of getting the job as a project manager and looking backwards and going, oh, all the talent shows, all the theatrical productions. I was being a project manager. Who knew? But you weren't thinking of it in terms of, well, 10 years from now, I'm going to need a career. It was just what you like to do. Mm-hmm. And so I think that happens for a lot of people, but it's frustrating from a staff point of view to try to explain this to prospective parents or members of the public. I actually had to resort at one time, and I don't know if this is something you want to edit out, but but I got paid. I got paid to say this. So I use the analogy of the South Park underpants gnomes and their business plan, right? So the boys go off to this cavern, and there's mounds of underpants with gnomes doing their gnomey things. And the boys are clearly confused, so the spokesman gnome, I guess, comes over and says, oh, yeah, well, here's our business plan. Take a look. Step 1, collect underpants. Step 2, it's like a whiteboard, and there's this big question mark. And step 3 is profit. So I kind of think that the Sudbury plan is step 1, give kids incredible amounts of freedom and responsibility. Step 2, and step 3, amazing young adults. And all I can say is that the model's been around for 50 years now. I've seen it for 20 years. And, you can't necessarily chart a linear path. And you can't necessarily say, well, this 12-year-old in 15 years is going to be here or there. And what they're doing now is going to directly, impact and inform and prepare them for this life of the future. But so I don't know. What was the question?
No, that was a good answer.
Lessons?
Yes, lessons. So what do you think is the best way for parents to support their kids and themselves while they're in the middle? Like, they're on step 2 and they're like, okay, I'm just going to sit here and wait for something to happen. What do you say to people who are in that position?
Well, I can't know for any given person at any given time what's the best thing, or again, there's not necessarily a path or a curriculum for the parents. But obviously, you want to start with getting as informed as possible. So there are books and articles and websites and videos, plenty of them available. And I think in particular for people who are in that dowdy kind of place, looking for interviews with alumni would be a terrific place to start, because essentially this is what you're aiming for in a very broad general sense. Like, I want my kid to be as whatever quality you see in that person as that person is. I want that for my kid. So there's a wealth of material out there. Just get informed on what it is, what the philosophy is, how the philosophy plays out. Second step, I would say, is to get involved, both locally, and I mean attending events that your school has, even if they're quote unquote just social events. Not just the panels or special speakers or discussions, but just get connected, plug into that community, because that is one of the greatest values of a Sudbury school for the adults as well as for the students, I think, is that sense of community, which really verges on family if you get really immersed in it. So get involved locally, and as much as you can, get involved more broadly. And that's where Sudbury Moments comes into play. And another thing that FOSS does is that we support this Google group called Sudbury School Families, which I created because I realized that I mentioned a while ago that the staff at the various Sudbury schools are connected to each other through a Google group, and we offer each other tremendous support, practical, moral, whatever kind of support. People who have been doing it for 50 years and people who are just getting started. So I thought, well, why don't we do that for like parents and families and non-staff people? So Sudbury School Families is the same kind of thing, where if you are a parent or a staff or a student or an alum of a Sudbury school, you can join this list and you can pose questions. So that, let's say you're at a small school and you only have really 2 full-time staff and you want a third opinion on something, or you say, well, I know if I talk to so-and-so, I'm just going to get this answer. Let me put it out to a broader group, because that's one of the real hazards, I guess, of being a family at especially a smaller school. It's easy to feel isolated. I mean, many of us, I think, are susceptible to feeling isolated already because we're pursuing this very niche alternative kind of model. And then if there are not that many people in your area doing it, then that can make it that much more daunting. So why not plug into a larger community and say, all right, I'm going to visit my parents for Thanksgiving. How do I talk to them about this? I've never come up with the best approach. And then maybe 5 or 10 people will tell you, well, here's what I try. Here's what I try. So cultivate that sense of community. Thirdly, I would say, talk to your staff members. Don't wait until problems get serious. If you have a concern, share it and see what kind of support you can get. It might not be as information or detail rich as you would like. It could be. We could set up a conference. It just depends on the situation. But I think that you shouldn't, don't assume that this little thing will just go away. Go ahead and bring it up. But as far as, let's say, supporting the kids directly, I think this harkens back to that point about getting informed. You can, the more informed you are, the better able you will be to support them in using the processes of the school. Okay, you're telling me this thing is going on at school. Who could you talk to about that? Do you want to write that up? If your school has mediation, bring that up. Basically, it's encouraging them to say, I know this is tough, but I know that you can do it. What's the next step? What is one thing that you could do to take action, to get the ball rolling on making the situation better? And then you see this becomes it's all part of the learning process. Because what Sudbury students get to learn is that, okay, there's this problem or there's this situation that's not satisfactory to me, but I know I can do something about it. I just need to find someone to ask my questions to. I need to find the right resource, or I need to get confirmation that, this isn't something I really want to do anymore. So the confidence and the resourcefulness and resilience that you see in Sudbury graduates, that you can trace back to things like that. Like, I'm super bored every day. My best friend doesn't like me anymore. These things that seem small and trivial, or can seem small and trivial to an adult, that's huge to the kids. And their process of going through that gives them tools, gives them confidence, and starts them on a pattern of not thinking that challenges are necessarily daunting, not being afraid to make mistakes, or not worrying that they're new or inexperienced or going to fumble their way through something. So I think it's about, so for how can parents support themselves in supporting their kids? I think it's get informed, get connected, and support your kid in the sense of directing them towards, I don't want to say solving it themselves necessarily, but encouraging them and pointing them towards the resources that exist at the school.
Great. That's a good answer. It's got all the points that I would have said for sure.
Awesome.
So I've got one more question for you, which is one I always ask my guests. It's my favorite question. So do you have a favorite memory of life at school? And it doesn't have to be at Alpine Valley, because I know you may have your favorite memory may have happened elsewhere, though I would hate to admit that. But
on the Alpine Valley School podcast,
yeah, exactly.
Well, you're in luck, because about 15 of my 20 Sudbury years are at AVS, so it's a much larger pool to draw from. And also, I was thinking about this, or I have been thinking about this, because I've noticed the pattern that you ask all the guests this. So, I sometimes will listen to the podcast while I'm running, and I think, well, how would I answer this? How would I answer this? And so my favorite memory is not something that happened during the school day, but when I left Alpine Valley in 2012, the first time that I moved to Austin. That's its own kind of tangent, long story. But so I was leaving AVS, and as far as we knew, it was for good. And after having been there for maybe 14 years at that point, so I was given a going away party, right? Typical, it happens. You give people going away parties, no big deal. But I have to, boy, I just keep coming back to this, because it felt kind of like attending my own funeral, but in a good way. Okay, it's like you don't have to die. You get to go to your funeral, but you get to not be the dead one. And because I was hearing all these, what at a funeral would be eulogies, and people wrote things and they said things, and just the tears were flowing, and I was like, the generosity was mind blowing. What blew me away, or what I was hearing, just blew me away, person after person after person. And I don't want to make this too much about me, because but the point is how surprised I was by all this. I knew all along. I got into this because there was a sense of purpose and meaning and changing the world and all that. But when you're immersed in following your passion, I think you're not necessarily self-conscious about what it is that you're doing. Like my story, or my mentioning your story with becoming a project manager. You're not doing it because 10 years from now you're going to get a really sweet compliment. You're just doing it because you're doing what you want. You're doing what brings you joy, and that has an impact on other people's lives that you might not have any idea how much of an impact it is. All those years at Alpine Valley, I was really just living my life, and I wasn't conscious that I was doing anything that remarkable. But then I go to this party, and just all the beautiful comments and stories, and I tell you, even now talking about it can get me a little teary, because a place like Alpine Valley isn't just a school. And I'm not the first person to say that it feels like home, or that it feels like family. Because it can be, if you stick with it, if you commit, work through all the difficulties and the scary stuff and the frustration. I'll tell you, I just can't imagine a better place to have spent such a significant chunk of my life. And I don't want to imagine what I'd be missing personally if I hadn't been shaped by this experience. So that's just something that's going to stick with me for the rest of my life, I think. That, and I think like a week before, I climbed to the top of the swing set, which was kind of awesome too.
I think we have a picture of that somewhere.
I think so. I think it's out there, because the kids were doing it, and I thought, well, why not? Because it was just fun. You're just hanging out. You're doing your thing. You're living your life, and you enrich each other in ways that maybe you don't ever know, or don't know for years later. But enrich is exactly what you're doing.
That's wonderful. That's a pretty good group best memory. That's of all the ones I've heard so far. That's pretty great.
Thanks. No, it was very special indeed, and I will always feel connected to Alpine Valley. And I've been back since I've left, to visit as often as I can. So it's just, I will warn people, Sudbury School is something that can get into you, and it can stick in the best possible way. So it's just a wonderful thing to have been part of.
Wow. It's certainly made Alpine Valley a better place that you were part of it.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you. And thanks for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was, I felt like I really arrived. Like, all right, now my turn. I get to talk to Missa.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time.
Of course, anytime, Missa.
I've known Bruce since I enrolled at Alpine Valley School as a student in 1998, and he has always been one of my heroes. My admiration for him and the work he's done has not lessened even slightly over the years, so it was truly an honor to interview him here. I hope his words of wisdom will help future Sudbury School founders feel inspired to continue their important journey. Thanks to Bruce for sharing his story. Alpine Valley School relies on donations from our community to fund our work, and our biggest fundraising event of the year is right around the corner. Colorado Gives Day is December 5th, and we need your help. To learn more, visit coloradogives.org/Alpine Valley School or talk with one of the staff members at the school. If you visit that website, you can even pre-schedule your donation for Colorado Gives Day. All donations are tax deductible and contribute directly to keeping Alpine Valley School a thriving environment for young people to pursue their passion. As always, I love hearing your feedback. If you have an idea for a show or any comments on a past show, please send them to me via email at podcast@alpinevalley.school.com. I do read all of your messages, and I've gotten some fantastic ideas for shows through this channel. So please keep those emails coming. You can also reach out to me on social media via Alpine Valley School's Facebook or Instagram pages. For links to those pages, please visit our website, www.alpinevalley.school.com. All of our social media is linked to at the very bottom of the homepage. Thanks for listening. I'm Missa Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back again soon with more stories of real learning for real life.